Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited for this.
For asking.
So yeah, I'm going to dive right in because I feel like we have quite a lot to talk about. It has been a year. So I've been covering ransomware for several years now, and the attacks are just showing no sign of slowing down at all. And that's despite companies spending records amounts on cybersecurity. So can you paint a picture for us of where we're at with ransomware right now and why this threat is still growing?
Nice to have a friend for a few minutes.
Would you like to take that?
Okay, well, we can start off with the loudest one in the bunch. I think, from my experience in being in cybersecurity for over 2 decades professionally, it looks to me like it's another pattern repeating, except the impact is changing. And that's really what ransomware, and the emergence of ransomware, coupled with the rise of cryptocurrency and the ability to extract payment from more sources. I think that's been, fascinating to watch emerge. And I think that, right now, from the patterns that I've seen, it's some of the same basic security principles that are so difficult to follow. Just because they're easy to describe doesn't mean they're easy to actually take place in your organization. So I think that's kind of, roughly where we are. And it's where we have been time and time before, only the impact is changing. The blast radius has changed.
Yeah, up until about 2019, ransomware was a fairly small problem that affected mainly small businesses, with the average demand being about $5,000. The position that we are now in is obviously drastically different, with multi-million-dollar demands being quite commonplace. And finding a solution to this problem is, I think, going to be extremely difficult.
Absolutely. And who is behind these attacks? Is this predominantly a state-sponsored threat, or is somebody else behind this?
As far as we know, it is mainly for-profit criminals. There are undoubtedly some state elements involved, but the bulk of the attacks are carried out for money.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's not just, it's the criminals, but they're also in a lot of places acting either on behalf as a surrogate to the state, or acting in a capacity that basically the state chooses to ignore their activity as long as it's focused outside of the country, of origin. So we do see these criminal groups sort of, symbiotically working with state actors directly as well. And then we also see them in fundraising for other activities. There's a lot of speculation around some ransomware attacks being used to fund North Korea's nuclear program. So they're using it as a method of fundraising. And then finally, I would say that there's also been an increase in the different types of attack vectors that we see. How many of you have noticed that the numbers of those SMS messages going to your phone from numbers that you don't recognize, saying that you have to dispute a bill that was charged to you, or that you have won a prize, or any of those types of things? Those attack vectors are getting much more common and much more direct to individuals.
Absolutely, and I think the kind of organizations that hackers are targeting are kind of diversifying as well. So Brett, I'm going to come to you with this one because I see you tracking it very closely. So over the past few months, we've seen these ransomware actors turning their attention to hospitals, schools. In the case of Costa Rica, we saw an entire government hit by ransomware. How serious is this situation right now for the public sector, and why are they such an attractive target for these ransomware actors?
It's very serious, but why they are an attractive target isn't entirely clear. We don't know whether the attacks are primarily or solely motivated by profit, or whether there may be some other motivations there as well from the groups that do have tenuous connections to other states. We just don't know. And just to go back to what we were saying before, that also makes the issue of data theft concerning. When data is stolen from a company in the defense space, for example, we've got no way of knowing whether it ends up. We don't know whether it's simply in the hands of for-profit criminals, whether it's passed over to their governments, or what, we just don't know.
Absolutely, and I just want to pick up on the point you said there about sort of the motivation behind this. So I remember with the Costa Rica hack, the attackers that claimed credit for that, Conti, they claimed that attack was politically motivated. Katie, do you think that's ever the case in these kind of attacks, or are they always sort of motivated by money?
I don't think there's an always that you could apply to anything that hackers do. I am a hacker, by the way. But in terms of motivation, money isn't the sole motivator of any of us, whether we're on the criminal side or on the fighting crime side. It's a combination of motivations, and I kind of break it down to compensation, recognition, and pursuit of intellectual happiness. And so some folks, I think, especially in the early days of hacking, where I grew up learning how to hack in the late 80s, early 90s, we did it out of curiosity. We did it because we were exploring and maybe making a little bit of harmless mischief. But when we see these ransomware attacks, it's the intent, it's the impact that we see massively changing. So I think that, for the average hacker, they may have various motivations over the course of their hacking life. And I definitely have friends who started out more on the dark side and are now, running companies that help fight people like how they used to be. But yeah, in terms of money, ransomware certainly is primarily, the goal is to get money, but also the goal may be disruption, right? And we've seen them also working to not just ransom the data, but they will ransom you, saying that they will release the data publicly, which is a different form of blackmail that they can use once they get that access.
And this year as well, we've seen these attackers, they've also gone after some really well-known companies. I think we've had NVIDIA, we've had Foxconn, we've had AMD, and that's to name just a few. It must be quite worrying for startups and startup founders seeing these massive companies getting hacked. They have seemingly endless resources and they're failing to protect themselves. Where are these companies going wrong?
There's probably no single answer on that. The attack vectors are going to change from company to company. When they do change, it could be a 0-day, or it could be a failure to implement MFA, or an MFA bypass. There's no standard answer. And that is what makes this problem so difficult to deal with. There's no simple or easy solution.
I would definitely agree with what Brett, you just said, because what we see is it's not just that organizations are getting parts of this wrong. It's that organizations evolve over time and go through periods of, almost building up their security and privacy, and then, it's a pretty good program for a while, and then we actually see those programs decay over time. I mean, if you look at the technology companies that are around today, I still think of Facebook as a new company, but they've been around since 2004 was the dorm room, Mark Zuckerberg was in his dorm room in 2004. So that's an older tech company, and you see these sort of the rise and fall of their technological and security and privacy capabilities. And that's what my company sees a lot, is that organizations may have started out strong, but technology jobs, people leave their jobs. Cybersecurity jobs are among the most heavily recruited jobs. So you basically see people put some measures in place and then leave. And then whether or not those measures stay up to date or they cover what's most important and everything. So that's what I think, that lends what we're seeing behind what Brett was saying, which is there is no one answer, and there may not be one answer for all time for an organization. It may change over time, and I think that's been one of the biggest problems. We can tell everybody to do all these best practices, but that might not be what keeps the intruders out, and it might not keep them out forever.
And compared to these sort of big name companies we've seen hacked over the past 12 months, are startups at an advantage given the fact they have perhaps less data, definitely less money, a smaller attack surface, or are they as much at risk?
I would say in some way they are at a slight advantage in that their attack surface isn't as large and their technology stack is newer. Katie talked about Decay, and that is absolutely right. Things do tend to deteriorate over time. Old networks and environments may not be as secure as newer ones.
So on the one hand, they definitely do have that advantage. And if you look at some of even the bigger tech companies, they took advantage of their newer code base and their newer tech stack to sort of leapfrog some of the older technology companies that maybe had been working at it for some time, right? I used to work at Microsoft. I think, Brett, you used to work at Microsoft too. So we won't drag Microsoft too much here. But my point is that, I think that sometimes startups can have an advantage, but sometimes they don't, right? So I accidentally hacked Clubhouse. That was a big unicorn startup that was popular for about 10 minutes, as they are. But during the height of its popularity, there were some security issues, and so I had downloaded the thing and tried it out, and it was terrible for my social anxiety. I hated it, but it had an attack surface, and I, can't change my nature. I happened to see that there were some problems, and when I tried to report the vulnerability to Clubhouse, it was like a weeks-long journey, and it took forever to get a person. And when I finally did get a person, it was one of the co-founders, and he sincerely wanted to fix the problem. But they hadn't made that choice to invest their early hires in hiring for security. So they already had millions of followers or millions of users, and they had that responsibility as a technology company. But the mentality of a startup, and they had fewer employees at that time than I have at my company, so they were really operating very lean at that time. So, it really depends, and I think for founders out there who are thinking about this, how can I protect myself against ransomware, they should be thinking about investing in security, not just early, but in proportion to the responsibility that you have. What kind of data do you have? How many people are you trying to protect? And I think, when startups do the unicorn thing and grow exponentially, they can often be at a massive disadvantage because they have not put those investments in place for security and privacy.
And Katie touched on an interesting point there, that it can be hard to let companies know that they have vulnerabilities. It's not necessarily easy, and attacks have actually unfolded and succeeded before people were able to contact a company and say, you're vulnerable, this is about to happen.
Yeah, so Katie, you've done quite a lot of this over your career. I know you've worked with Microsoft and the Department of Defense on bug bounty programs whereby people can report these serious security flaws to you. Is this something you would advise startups do? Should they be working with hackers at this early stage to kind of pick out the holes in their systems?
Well, it's a complicated answer because yes, of course, you should be willing to hear from any member of the public who wants to give you important security or privacy feedback, right? That is something that as a startup, you want feedback. You want early adopters, you want beta testers, you want feedback. You definitely want security feedback. However, I have seen a phenomenon where startups will say, I will just simply go out and start a bug bounty program and I'll start paying for each bug. Well, your startup nest egg will probably evaporate by the time you pay out for all of those bugs if you have not built in security in a security development lifecycle. And those are all very grown-up words, not startup-y words. But you do have to internalize that magic before you are ready to offer cash rewards, because otherwise it would be like trying to get your house painted, like the exterior of your house painted, and just offering, $1 for every brush stroke that somebody walks by and paints, and they might all paint the same spot on your house. You need to basically do professional assessments, build security in from the ground up, and then you are ready to potentially open the front door and welcome reports from hackers. But if you do it before that, actually Clubhouse had a bug bounty program, and it still took me weeks to get to them. Why? Because they had been convinced by a fellow startup in their, their VC's portfolio that they could start one of these programs privately, and any hacker who came to them, they could get the bug locked up in a non-disclosure agreement, because it's a private program, and they may never have to fix it. Unfortunately, the person who found a bug was the person who wrote the ISO standards on how to report vulnerabilities and get them fixed, so they really weren't going to get away with that with me. But you can imagine how many other hackers probably came to them and probably gave up because they couldn't even find that front door. So yes and no, be prepared for friendly people to report security issues to you, but by be prepared, it means more than just saying, I have a bug bounty program, sign this NDA.
And I guess maybe these bug bounty programs shouldn't be a first stop
for
a startup. There will be people in the audience that want to know, what are the really basic things I need to have in place from day one to ensure I'm building a resilient startup? What would you say are those cybersecurity basics they should implement now?
Well, this is something I tell to everyone, and this is regardless of whether or not you have a startup company. Enable multi-factor authentication on everything you have, every account you have, and so startups should be doing this too. I mean, we saw that even with multi-factor authentication, an older startup like Twitter was hacked recently, right? They had multi-factor authentication, but it was a combination of a persistent attacker using social engineering to trick the Twitter employee into giving them their multi-factor code. But that's one thing that I say that consumers and technologists and anybody who has something that they would like to protect and not have hackers ruin their day, I would say multi-factor authentication is one of the best things you can do.
It's undoubtedly the most significant thing that any organization can do to improve its security posture.
Absolutely. And we say that multi-factor authentication is great. Startups should have this in place. But over the past few months, we've seen hackers bypass this, which is crazy. Should these startups, should they be ensuring their employees know how to spot these risks? Like, how important is it to make sure the people are aware of the problem?
There's no single perfect solution. It's a matter of stacking security layer upon security layer. So yeah, staff training in conjunction with MFA, in conjunction with other things, all serves to reduce risk.
Great. And over the past few months, we have actually seen some rare wins in the war against ransomware. The US government announced that it had seized millions of dollars that had been paid to these ransomware groups. It arrested some members of these gangs. Katie, how would you rate these efforts so far? Are they making an impact?
They definitely are making an impact, and I think that anything that we can do to raise the bar and make consequences happen, for some of these crimes, I think is making an impact. However, with so many soft targets out there, it's just a matter of time before the next target has to continue to do business, or in a lot of cases, do healthcare, do something that threatens life and limb. So I think, yes, it's making an impact, but is it making a dent? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's all about swinging the risk-reward ratio, and every little thing that we can do to swing the needle more towards risk and further away from reward is a good thing. It's not necessarily going to solve the problem or even make that much of a dent, but it's better than the alternative of doing nothing.
We've had a really good question from the audience, actually, that follows on quite nicely from that one, that is about sanctions. So the question is, does the US need a better system of sanctioning ransomware entities, given that we see these groups, they just keep coming back, they keep rebranding? Do you think it's working?
I don't believe that sanctions against individual groups are necessarily particularly effective. I do believe that restricting the circumstance in which organizations are permitted to pay demands generally could be effective.
Great. And another great question we've had through actually is ransomware fundamentally a cryptocurrency problem?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, I think that we would be fooling ourselves if we didn't notice that the rise of ransomware and the rise of cryptocurrency values have been correlated, right? And I think the regulatory scheme around decentralized currency is partly to blame for how hard it is to track down the criminals, right? So I'm not saying that it's a cryptocurrency problem, but I am saying that, certainly some of the things that people love about decentralized currencies are the very things that make it an ideal, system, whereas before, the only anonymized currency was cash.
At the same time, business email compromise, which uses the traditional banking systems, is also extremely profitable. So cryptocurrency isn't necessarily entirely to blame for the problem, although it's very likely a facilitator.
And do you think there are ever circumstances under which organizations hit by ransomware should pay the ransom demand?
I think that's a really complex question, and so I am a small business owner, and if there were an existential threat to my business where my business would not exist anymore if I didn't pay the ransom, well then obviously I would have to pay the ransom or just agree to not do business anymore. So I think that there are some circumstances where people will have very little choices left to them, which is also why the ransomware task force, that had come together to give advice about this, didn't, recommend that paying ransomware be criminalized, the payment of it itself. But I do think that they're, requiring organizations to report that they have paid ransomware, I think that will help organizations try and use their imagination and their resources to see if there's any other way they can return to normal business operations without having to pay. So it just gives them that pause.
We do also see some organizations, though, choosing to pay to prevent data being released online, or simply because it is the cheapest option. The continuation of their business may not be under threat, but they nonetheless choose to pay anyway. And that is, I think, an area around which there could be some additional regulation. Possibly companies shouldn't be paying simply because it is the least expensive option.
And sticking to the regulation side of things, so startups with customers in Europe, if they get hit by ransomware, the data is leaked, they then have to report that within 72 hours. Is there any similar legislation in the US? And if not, should we be doing more?
As far as I know, there is only industry-specific legislation, and it varies according to the state. There is no generalized reporting or disclosure requirements, and that is something I do think needs to change. The fact that so few companies do report and disclose their incidents makes it hard to measure the extent of the problem. If policymakers can't see what impact their policies are having, how do they know whether they're working?
So I've got to put on my quasi-regulatory advisor hat. There are some regulations that are coming up in the United States that will require, beyond just the breach disclosure regulations that were already on the books, but will require the US government be notified of a security significant incident. Once you are aware that that is significant in some way, then you have 72 hours to let the US government know. Now, they're trying to work out, essentially the kinks of how this might work. And I've seen draft bills saying that it should extend to even when you find out about a vulnerability, that you should then report it to the government. I think that is the worst idea for cybersecurity. It is a terrible idea. Imagine if you're an adversary for a second, and instead of having to hack individual companies to find out let's say, what are their unfixed security vulnerabilities? Go to their bug database and find that out. That's frequently a target of state-sponsored attacks, is hacking Microsoft, Apple, Google, et cetera, and going for their bug databases to find out what can I exploit, for quite some time. Can you imagine concentrating that for all US-based companies of a certain size or significance in one bug database kept by the US government? I think that would be a terrible idea. I advise against it anytime a legislator will listen to me. And it's a difference between an actual incident and breach, which of course we already have legislation for breach notification, versus an incident that is under investigation versus a vulnerability that may or may not have been exploited yet. And I think understanding the differences in those terms is going to be key to getting the right legislation, as opposed to legislation that will literally just collect it all in a giant buggy bank, like a piggy bank, for an adversary to come over and smash with a hammer whenever they get close.
Absolutely, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. We've just had another great question through, and Brett, I know this is something you have been working on recently. So how effective are ransomware decryptors in fighting back against these attackers?
It depends what you mean by effective. In terms of helping individual companies, they can be extremely effective because they help them recover their data without needing to pay possibly a multi-million-dollar ransom demand. In terms of combating the ransomware problem generally, less so. As soon as the attackers discover that their ransomware has a weakness that's being exploited, they fix it.
And another question just come through. Is it worth startups investing in cyber insurance?
I think for a lot of startups, they have to, right? It's a requirement to do business. Often, if you were trying to get a contract signed, your customer will require you to have cyber insurance. So I think it's a cost of doing business that all companies should plan on building in. Now, the level of it, that's another matter. But.
Awesome. And I guess what more could the US government be doing to help startups in this sector? If a startup is hit by ransomware, is there support for them from the government, or do they kind of have to go it alone?
There is limited support. No one is going to come in and solve their problem for them, unfortunately. Law enforcement can certainly provide help and assistance, and in some cases may be aware of the existence of a decryptor, but hasn't yet been publicized. So it's absolutely worth involving law enforcement. Companies may find out the solutions to their problems are available.
I agree. I think there's some limited support from the government that's available, but if you look at our government, we've been struggling, and most governments are like this, struggling to keep up with the demands of protecting the data that the government has on its own. So the amount of help they might be able to extend to others, small companies, is probably going to be limited. But I would say that if startups want help and inspiration in looking, rather than looking towards the government, they should look to some of the more established private companies that have provided a lot of transparency, insight, and even tools to help make management of their security and privacy easier. And I think, honestly, it's a community-based defense, no matter how you slice it. So it doesn't really matter if the help is coming from the government or another private company.
Absolutely. And if a startup is hit by ransomware, if or when perhaps, what are some tips you can offer to founders in order to manage the crisis well? I mean, it can be scary. Where do they begin in that situation?
Plan in advance. Assume you will be hit and know what you're going to do if it happens. The last thing you want to be doing in the event of a ransomware attack or any other type of cybersecurity incident is working out what your playbook should look like. That should already be sorted out in advance.
That's exactly right. It's muscle memory that gets organizations through any crisis, whether it's ransomware or some other attack, and then making sure that it's not just your engineering teams that have done the fire drills.
Sure.
Make sure your legal team, your communications team, your customer support team, any of those teams should also be participants in learning how to prepare for these kinds of attacks.
Absolutely. And I just want to go back to the title of this talk. So the title of this panel is Winning the War on Ransomware. What do you guys think that ultimately looks like?
This is such an ambitious title, my God.
It's so ambitious. I had to bring it up.
I don't think we do win the war, at least not anytime soon. I think the best we can hope for is a reduction realistically. This problem is going to be around for a very long time. I don't see any speedy solution.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that we are part of a larger ecosystem, and we exist on an internet that was never designed to be secure in the first place. And so in this matrix where we live, we just have to be prepared to evolve and adapt. And I think, some of the things that we were talking about, like I said at the beginning, they are cyclical, but the manifestation of how it's playing out and what the impact is to startups especially is starting to change and be more serious.
Absolutely. And I know we're focused on ransomware here, but are there any other threats that founders should be aware of right now, should be keeping an eye out for right now?
Climate change, that's something we should all be aware of and be keeping an eye out.
And in security terms, business email compromise is probably the next biggest threat.
Absolutely. I'm just going to go through our questions. So we've had a question about where these hackers are coming from, where these attacks are originating. So somebody says, lots of these ransomware attackers are based in Russia. How is the Ukraine war affecting US government efforts to combat this?
Yeah, first, it's important to note that we don't really know where they're based on. Yes, lots are believed to be in Russia or the CIS, but the affiliates, the people who use the ransomware to carry out the attacks, could be based absolutely anywhere, including Canada. There was a former employee of the Canadian federal government extradited to the US earlier this year in connection with network ransomware attacks.
It's interesting you mentioned the affiliates. So we have seen sort of a lot of what I've been covering recently is these ransomware actors moving to ransomware as a service. So that's whereby they kind of rent out the ransomware, right? Is that making it harder to track them?
Yeah, that can be used as an obfuscation tactic. Affiliates can work with multiple groups simultaneously. They sometimes deploy different types of ransomware simultaneously. There have been cases where they have initially communicated through one ransomware group's chat portal and concluded the conversation through another's. So the connections are all blurry.
Absolutely. And another technique we've kind of seen growing over the past few months is double extortion. Mm-hmm. So it used to be when you were hit by ransomware, your data was encrypted. If you had great backup software, cool, great, I will unencrypt that. How is this making the fight against ransomware even more challenging?
It shouldn't be impacting us at all. Paying to prevent the release of data really makes no sense. That data has already been stolen, the company's already had a data breach, the genie can't be put back in the bottle, and many companies have been extorted for a second time using the same set of data that was supposedly destroyed after they paid the initial ransom. So paying in those circumstances, to my mind, isn't a good idea.
No, I think the other thing that companies, if they want to really take a defense in-depth approach, they should be looking at not saying so many things in email or and whatnot. Now, there are certain things that you can't change, the sensitivity of a contract or a document that just needs to be what it is. But you can certainly avoid some of these incredibly embarrassing email dumps where I never understand why people don't write email as if it's a postcard and it's being sent to the Washington Post, because you should be writing your emails as if they will end up in a data dump someday. And that is absolutely something that you should be thinking about. Same thing with your text messages. I mean, what is it? What's the Twitter acquisition drama where we're getting to see all of these clear text messages, and that's just not from ransomware attacks, that's from court discovery, right? So you're protecting yourself against a whole bunch of embarrassment if you just stop writing things down.
Amazing. So I was saying to you guys just before we came out, I really want to end this on a positive note, and we were kind of struggling. Thankfully, we have had a great question through that I think means we can end it on a high. So are there any security startups out there right now that you think are doing amazing things that can save us from this?
No, there's no one I can think of.
I tried.
There almost certainly are. I just can't think of any who are worth calling out in this.
I will call out a security startup. It's called Gray Noise, and it's not about ransomware at all. But what it does, it's a friend of mine, Andrew Morris, made this company. What it does is it filters out the noise, right? Of, no, these are probably friendly scans from, known security researchers versus this is actual attack traffic. And why is that important? And why is that something that a whole venture-founded company could be built around? We are a limited resource, Brett and I and people like us, we can't grow up the next generation of cybersecurity and privacy professionals fast enough to protect all of you. So what do you need? You need to operate with the staff you have, and ideally you need to filter out the noise. So Gray Noise is my go-to of giving a huge shout out, and then I because I serve on a couple of federal advisory boards for cybersecurity, the newest one is the Cyber Safety Review Board. So that's kind of almost like the NTSB that goes and examines when a plane has crashed and figures out why did the plane crash and then distributes that information. This board was created by executive order, and one of the things that we found in the discovery, of what happened with the Log4j attack was it was the companies with muscle memory that did the best, number one, and the companies that could act fast and filter out the noise in the middle of an attack. So I would say, get that muscle memory. You can only do that, teach yourself that. You can maybe get some partners to help you with that. But then with what little staff you do have, get some Gray Noise, because that will make their lives so much easier and your staff will burn out. I'm going to just throw it out there, make up a statistic, 30% slower with Gray Noise. I am not an investor, by the way. He's just a friend, and I just found them so effective.
I think it's also worth mentioning quickly that government does now seem to be doing a much better job of pulling in private sector expertise, involving people like Katie in the policy-making process, and that's a good thing. It is going to make a difference.
We managed it. We managed to end on a
we did.
positive note. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, guys. I really enjoyed that. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.